This is David Barsamian, and I'm talking to Noam Chomsky from his home in Lexington, Massachusetts. Thank you very much for joining us, Noam.
Glad to be with you again.
You know, tis the season of fantasies and fairy tales, and in that holiday spirit, today's New York Times editorial offers the following history lesson, quote, America became rich by tapping its natural resources and building large manufacturing plants that imposed rigid work rules.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, what an inspiring story.
Well, actually, it's a good year to mention that. This year is sort of historic in this respect. For one thing, it's the centenary of the destruction of the largest union in the United States, the American Steelworkers Union, by Andrew Carnegie, who had just in 1892 established the Carnegie Steelworks, which became the first billion-dollar U.S. corporation. He had a his most advanced major plant was in Homestead, Pennsylvania, which was a working-class city with a working-class mayor and lively cultural scene and commitment to workers' rights and so on, and a union base. He locked the workers out. They took over the control of the plant and the town. He sent Pinkerton guards who were driven away. He then got the National Guard sent in, which took over. And there were exactly what the New York Times describes. In fact, they described it at the time. He was able to not only destroy the union, but institute 12-hour work days, miserable labor standards. The company History, published not too long after, described this as the basis for the enormous profits that they made. In addition, of course, there was though he was a pacifist, but he succeeded in overcoming his pacifist principles to take a huge contract for building up for steel for naval vessels, which were the U.S. was then building up a big navy for purposes of international intervention. And he also succeeded crucially, and this is important, in essentially in destroying utterly the democratic structure of the town and the region. Scholars who went in to investigate Homestead afterwards found that people were just afraid to talk to them. They wouldn't even talk to them in their homes because they were too terrified of blacklisting and other retaliation. When Mother Jones, 89-year-old labor organizer, came to Homestead in 1919 to try to help organize again, they made another failed effort to organize a union. She was just carted off by the cops when she tried to make a public statement. In fact, as late as the 1930s, when Roosevelt's Secretary of Labor, Frances Perkins, came to Homestead, she had to be under police protection. It wasn't until the mid-30s, in the course of union organizing and great public activism, that the elements of democracy were restored to Homestead, and they didn't last very long. I mean, the attack on the union started right away, and in fact, 1992 is a historic year in that respect too. This was the first time in 60 years that a major corporation has dared to use the ultimate weapon against a major union, namely Caterpillar, which broke a UAW strike by hiring scabs, just as Andrew Carnegie and Frick had done a century earlier. So the Times has a point to make. I mean, if you impose harsh enough working standards, you can create profits. Now, in fact, as the Times well knows, I didn't read the editorial, it turns out to be it's much easier to move production earlier, easier than before, far easier than before, to move production to high repression, low wage areas like Mexico or increasingly Eastern Europe or Indonesia or whatever. And there you can really impose iron work rules and extract a lot of profit, and meanwhile leave the United States with the inner cities that we see and so on. So all that's accurate. Well, glad to see that the Times is saying something true. a little background that they might add, but that can't ask for everything.
Well, this America became rich by tapping its natural resources. It's almost a mimicry of the Zionist myth, a land without people for a people without a land. The brave and enterprising European settlers came to these shores, and they found this vast and empty and fertile land with abundant flora and fauna, and they developed it like some natural process.
Well, that's partly true. They first had to exterminate the native population and drive them off the lands, and exterminate is the word they used, and did. And after exterminating the population and bringing in huge numbers of slaves to work for them, they developed the resources.
At the Little Rock Economic Conference and elsewhere, there's much talk of economic recovery and restoring competitiveness. Gar Alperovitz takes a dim view that federal policy can reverse basic problems. He writes that what is being proposed is, quote, not likely to make a major dent in our deeper economic problems. We may simply be in for a long, painful era of unresolved economic decay. Would you agree or disagree with
I should say that I haven't read the New York Times, but I did read this morning's Financial Times in London, and they talk with some pleasure of the fiscal conservatism shown by Clinton and his advisors. There are some real issues there. First of all, as far as Gar Alperovitz's comment, I think it's accurate, but we have to be a little careful in the use of terms. When he says America's in for a long period of decline or something like that, we have to decide what we mean by America. I mean, if by the United States we mean the geographical area, he's, I'm sure, right. There has been decline, and there will be further decline. In fact, the country is moving into picking up many of the aspects of a third world society. That's an automatic consequence of sending productive labor elsewhere. So, say, GM is, as the press constantly reports, closing some 24 factories or so in North America. But what you only read about in the small print is that it's opening new factories, including, for example, a $700 million high-tech factory in East Germany in an area of huge unemployment where they can pay 40% of the wages of Western Europe and none of the benefits. Or as the Financial Times puts it, leading world business journal, they don't have to worry about the pampered West European workers any longer. They can just get highly exploited third world workers now that Eastern Europe's being pressed back to its traditional third world status. Same in Mexico, same in Thailand, and so on. There's a consequence of that. As I say, we become a third world country. And so if by the United States, at least in some respects, so if by the United States we mean the geographical area, he's right. On the other hand, if by the United States you mean U.S.-based corporations, then it's not right. In fact, the indications are to the contrary. So the share of the United States in international manufacturing trade is declining, has been declining, if we mean by the United States the geographical area. But that share has been stable or probably even somewhat increasing if by the United States we mean U.S.-based corporations. And that's a major factor. I think Gar is right in saying that the policies now being discussed will have only a cosmetic effect on the United States as a geographical area, but I think they probably will be beneficial to the United States as a system of U.S.-based finance and industry, which is why the business community tended to give Clinton a good deal of support. Now, these last couple of days, the conferences, and in fact the elections too, did deal with a significant issue. For once there was an issue in the election. It wasn't just nothing. As usual, the issue had to do with a tactical disagreement within business circles. And they are facing an objective problem. There's no doubt about it. The objective problem, the core of it has to do with what's called industrial policy. Now, we have to put aside a lot of nonsense before we can talk about this. The United States has always had an active state industrial policy, just like every other industrial country. Outside of ideologues and colleges and the press, no one thinks that capitalism is a viable system, and nobody has thought that for 60 or 70 years at least, if ever. It has been understood certainly since the Second World War, since the Great Depression and the war, and in fact long before, that the only way a system of private enterprise can survive is if there's extensive government intervention to regulate disorderly markets and to protect private capital from the destructive effects of the market system, to organize a public subsidy for advanced sectors, targeting advanced sectors of industry, and so on and so forth. So every advanced country, you know, whether it's Germany or Japan or by now South Korea or certainly the United States or France, whatever, have always had active industrial policy. And in fact, if you trace this back, it goes back right to the first industrializing country, namely England. So it's always been true of U.S. history, and increasingly, and in fact very consciously so, since the Depression and the war. Now, the U.S. nobody ever called it industrial policy. The reason they're talking about industrial policy, it was always masked. It was masked within the Pentagon system, which was internationally, it was an intervention force, but domestically, the Pentagon system always was, and was understood to be from the late 40s consciously, was understood to be and was a method by which the government can coordinate the private economy, can provide welfare to it, in effect, can subsidize it, can arrange the flow of taxpayer money to research, development, state-guaranteed market for excess production, target advanced industries for development, and so on. Just about every successful and flourishing aspect of the U.S. economy has always relied on this kind of government involvement, and much of it has been masked by the Pentagon system. Not entirely, but much of it has been masked by the Pentagon. Well, why are people now talking about industrial policy? The reason is that the mask is dropping, and that's an objective problem. It is very difficult now to get people to be willing to lower their consumption and their aspirations in order to divert investment funds to high-technology industry on the pretext that the Russians are coming. There are various efforts to continue this. In fact, the current public relations stunt in Somalia, in my opinion, is an effort which I don't think is going to work to try to reinvigorate this system, but it's in trouble. In fact, economists and bankers and others have been pointing out openly for some time that one of the main reasons why the current recovery is so sluggish is that the government has not been able to resort to the traditional pump priming mechanism, the traditional mechanism of economic stimulation, namely increased military spending with all of its multiplier effects and so on. That's just not available. And that's an objective fact, which, and the reason, and there's another fact that goes right alongside it, which is independent of this, and that is that the cutting edge of technology and industry has for some time visibly been shifting in another direction, away from the sort of electronics-based advanced industry of the post-war period and towards biology-based industry and commerce. So biotechnology, genetic engineering, design of seeds and drugs and even animal species and so on. That's expected to be a huge growth industry with enormous profits. And it's, if you think about it, it's vastly more important than electronics. In comparison, electronics is a kind of frill. I mean, this has to do with the means of life and existence, which the government and U.S. corporations hope that U.S. commercial enterprises will be able to dominate and, if possible, even monopolize. But it's very hard to disguise all of the government involvement in that behind the Pentagon cover. I mean, even if the Russians were still there, you couldn't do that. So there are some real problems, and that's why you have open discussion now of industrial policy. It was pretty openly proposed and discussed in the last 2 days' meetings, and in fact throughout the campaign. And there are differences between the two political parties on this. The Clinton people are more upfront about these needs, and the Reaganites, who are Reagan-Bush types, who are more fanatically ideological, still to some extent have their heads in the sand about it, although the Reagan administration did set up a government-based corporation to try to get the computer chip industry back into operation, and succeeded, and was in fact highly protectionist. But they were a bit more dogmatic on this issue, and I think that's one of the main reasons why Clinton had substantial business support. So those are real phenomena, and they'll have to be dealt with. I mean, the government, or take say this question that they've been talking about for the last couple of days of infrastructure or human capital, as they put it, meaning kind of a vulgar way of saying keep people alive and allow them to have an education and so on. By now, the business community is well aware that they've got problems with that. So take, say, the Wall Street Journal, which has been the most extreme advocate of Reaganite lunacies for the past 10 years. They're now publishing articles in which they're bemoaning the consequences without, of course, conceding that those are the consequences. So, for example, they had a big news article a couple of weeks ago on the state of California and the collapse of the educational system, which they're very upset about because it was about San Diego in particular. But, businessmen in the San Diego area have relied on the state system, that means on a public subsidy, to provide them with skilled workers and junior managers and, applied research and so on and so forth. And the system's in collapse. Well, the reason the system's in collapse is obvious. The large cutbacks in social spending in the federal budget and the huge federal deficit, all of which the Wall Street Journal supported, simply transferred the burden of keeping people alive and functioning to the states. And the states are unable to support that burden, and they're in serious trouble. And they tried to hand it down to the municipalities, which too are in serious trouble. And one of the consequences is that the very fine educational system in the state of California is in serious difficulty, and now businessmen are complaining about it. They want the government to get back in the business of providing them with what they need, skilled workers, research, and so on, and that's going to mean a reversal of the rather the fanaticism that the Wall Street Journal and others like it have been applauding for these years. Those are real problems, and they're going to have to deal with them somehow. I mean, even if they export a good deal of production, we still have a national economy.
Yeah, at this Little Rock conference, though, I have heard Clinton talk about structural problems and rebuilding the infrastructure of the country. And one attendee, Ann Markison, who's a Rutgers economist and author of a new book, Dismantling the Cold War Economy, she talked about the excesses of the Pentagon system and the distortions and damages that it has caused to the U.S. economy. So it seems that there is at least some discussion of these issues that I don't recall ever coming up before.
And the reason is that they simply can't maintain the Pentagon-based system. So you've got to start talking about it.
Well, talking about it is one thing, but do they really have a clue about what to do? And can they have a clue? Is that even?
Well, sure. I think they have a clue about what to do. The question, they know perfectly well what they can do. I mean, if you listen to smart economists like last couple of days, say Bob Solow, who started the thing off, and on, they have some pretty reasonable ideas as to what to do. I mean, what they want to do is what is openly done by Japan and Germany, and in fact every functioning economy, namely, rely on government initiatives to provide the basis for private profit, and do it openly. The U.S. has been doing it indirectly through the Pentagon system, which is, in fact, kind of inefficient, and won't work anymore anyway for the most part. So, yes, they would like to do it openly. However, the question is whether that can be done. There are a lot of problems. One problem is that the enormous debt created during the Reagan years, and that's debt at all levels. I mean, federal, state, local, household, even corporate debt. That makes it extremely difficult to launch constructive programs, which is why they're faced with this regular contradiction.
You mean there's no capital available?
Yeah. And in fact, that was probably part of the purpose of the Reaganite borrow and spend program.
To eliminate capital?
Well, you recall about 10 years ago, when David Stockman was kicked out, he had some interviews with William Greider in which he pretty much said that the idea was to try to put a cap on social spending simply by debt. There wouldn't be anything around. I mean, there'll always be plenty to subsidize the rich, but like the Pentagon, but you won't be able to pay aid for dependent mothers, only aid for dependent corporate executives. However, they may have overdone it. Furthermore, there's another problem. It's a cultural and ideological problem. They have for years relied on a kind of the propaganda system has been based on denial of these truths. I mean, it's other countries that have government involvement and social services and so on. We're rugged individualists, So IBM doesn't get anything from the government. In fact, they get plenty, but it's through the Pentagon. And we also happen to have the population is, propaganda aside, the population is pretty individualistic and, kind of dissident and doesn't take to orders very well by comparative standards. And it's not going to be easy to sell people this. I mean, it's going to mean, for one thing, a big reversal of, in Europe, say, these cultural factors are significant. I mean, in Europe, there has been a kind of social contract. It's now declining for exactly the reasons that I mentioned, but there has been a social contract largely imposed by the strength of the unions, in my opinion, the organized workforce, and the relative weakness of the business community, which is not as dominant in Europe as it has been here for all kind of historical reasons. That led to a kind of social contract, if you like, in which the government does see primarily to the needs of private wealth, but it also creates a not insubstantial safety net for the rest of the population, so general health care and reasonable services and so on. We haven't had that, in part because we don't have the same organized workforce, and we have a much more class-conscious and dominant business community. In Japan, pretty much the same results were achieved, but I think there the reasons largely were the highly authoritarian culture. I mean, people just do what they're told. So you tell them you're going to cut back consumption. They have very low standard of living, actually, considering their wealth. Cut back consumption and work hard and so on. People just do it. That's not going to be so easy to do here. It's going to be many problems.
You mentioned the GM plant moving to Mexico. There's also Smith Corona from Cortland, New York. I think it's the last U.S.-based typewriter company. That, too, is moving to Mexico. And there's a whole belt, there's a corridor along the border of pollution and toxic waste, all these maquiladoras, where there's incredible levels of lead in the water and high levels of pollution, and workers are working for $5 a day.
Yeah, actually, the case that I mentioned was GM moving to East Germany, which is, in a way, more interesting. Tells you what the Cold War was all about. But you're right about Mexico. And, in fact, it's kind of interesting to look at this issue. One of the major issues before the country right now, right through the whole electoral period, is NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. It's quite interesting to see how that's been handled. You learn a lot about the country and about the future from looking closely at that. There is no doubt that NAFTA is going to have very large-scale effects on the life of Americans and Mexicans too. You can debate what the effect will be, but nobody doubts that it'll be enormous. Quite likely, the effect will be to accelerate just what you've been describing. That is, to accelerate the flow of productive labor to Mexico, which is a totalitarian dictatorship and very brutal and repressive. So therefore you can guarantee low wages, and during what's been called the Mexican economic miracle of the last decade. Wages have dropped probably 60% or so. Union organizers get killed. If the Ford Motor Company wants to toss out its workforce and hire, slave labor, they just do it. Nobody stops them, and pollution and so on goes on unregulated. So it's a great place for investors. Incidentally, one might think that NAFTA, sending productive labor down to Mexico might improve their real wages down there, maybe level the two countries, but that's most unlikely. One reason is the repression, which prevents organization that could lead to raising wages. Another is that another consequence of NAFTA will be flooding Mexico with industrial agricultural products from the United States, all based ultimately on big public subsidies, which will undercut Mexican agriculture. So they'll be flooded with American crops, which it's expected will drive about maybe 13 million people off the land into urban areas or into the maquiladora areas, which just means another major factor driving down wages. It's not at all clear, and plenty of economists, even in the World Bank, don't particularly expect that this will lead to raising wages. It may not have that effect at all. It will almost certainly be a big bonanza for investors in the United States and for the wealthy sectors in Mexico that are their counterparts, who are, of course, the ones applauding the agreement, and the professional classes who work for them and so on. It'll very likely be quite harmful for American workers. May lose hundreds of thousands of jobs or lower the level of jobs. In fact, largely Hispanic and black workers are the ones who are going to be hurt most.
Well, while those jobs are being lost, though, U.S. corporate profits are increasing. Is that what you're saying?
I mean, corporations are doing very well. This is one of the best years for corporate profits.
So do you see, is NAFTA and GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades, will essentially formalize on an institutional level North-South relations?
That's the idea, in fact. And what's kind of interesting and tells us a lot about where we're going is the discussion about this. Now, this is a major issue for the United States. It'll also, incidentally, almost certainly degrade environmental standards. So, for example, corporations will be able to argue that EPA standards are violations of free trade agreement. That's already happening in the Canada-U.S. part of the free trade agreement. Its general effect will be to drive life down to the lowest level. That's what while keeping profits high. Well, again, one can debate this, but there's no doubt that the consequences are enormous, and it's interesting to see how it's been handled. It didn't even arise in the campaign. I mean, there were a few meaningless words, but it basically didn't arise in the electoral campaign. The public hasn't the foggiest idea what's going on. In fact, they can't know. One reason is that the NAFTA agreement is a secret. It's an executive agreement which is not available. To give you an indication of the extent to which this is true, in 1974, the Congressional Trade Act was passed, and one of its provisions was that on any trade-related issue, there has to be an analysis and input by a labor advisory committee that was set up, which is based in the unions. So obviously they have to have an analysis and report on NAFTA. Well, the NAFTA agreement was signed by the president. It's an executive agreement in secret in mid-August of this year. The Labor Advisory Committee was notified. They were informed that their report is due on September 9th of this year. However, they were not given the text of the agreement. They were only given the text, and then apparently only a partial text, about 24 hours before the report was due, ensuring that they could not even convene and obviously couldn't write a serious report. Well, these are conservative labor leaders, not the kind of guys who criticize the government much. They nevertheless wrote a very acid report. They said, to the extent that we can look at this thing in the few hours that are given us, it looks like it's going to be a total disaster for working people, for the environment, for Mexicans, and a great boon for investors. They pointed out that property rights are being protected all over the place, but working rights are never mentioned. And they also bitterly condemned the utter contempt for democracy that was demonstrated by just not even allowing them to look at it. In fact, they said, parts of it are still being kept secret. Well, that's interesting. I mean, that's an indicator. GATT is the same. I mean, nobody knows what's going on there unless you're some kind of specialist in the topic.
Have you seen details of these treaties?
Well, you can see details in the secondary comment on them, like the Labor Advisory Committee report and others.
But nothing's been published.
Theoretically, by now, it's possible to get a text. But the point is, the crucial point, I mean, even if you and I could get a text, what does that mean for American democracy? How many people can figure out, or even know, how many people even know that this is going on? How many people in the general public, I should say the Labor Advisory Committee report was never reported by the press. No, people not only don't know what's happening to them, they don't even know that they don't know. GATT is even more far-reaching. I just came back from a couple of weeks in Europe, as you know, and in Europe this is a pretty big issue in the European community context. I mean, one of the big concerns, public concerns in the European community, it's described as nationalism and so on, but what it really has to do with is what's called in EC parlance the democratic deficit, meaning the gap that is developing between executive decisions, which are secret, and democratic, or at least partially democratic, institutions like parliaments, which are less and less able to influence decisions made at the community level. And now all of this is a marvelous device for rendering democratic forms entirely meaningless. It means decisions are being raised to crucial decisions with enormous impact, are being raised to a level where the population can't influence them even indirectly through parliaments, and furthermore doesn't know about them, and even, as in this case, doesn't even know that it doesn't know. I mean, that leads us towards a goal that has long been sought, namely maintaining democratic forms, but ensuring that there's no interference with private power. And this is kind of a reflection of the globalization of the economy. I mean, over history, governmental institutions have, to a considerable extent, tended to reflect the form that's being taken by economic power and its organization. It's not, 100%, but there's a big tendency in that direction, and I think that's what we're now seeing. The economy is being internationalized, meaning, as a consequence, that the geographical industrial countries are being deindustrialized, or the corporations are doing fine. And this internationalized economy, which is run largely by transnational corporations and supranational banks and so on, they're creating their own governmental structures, like the GATT and NAFTA and the IMF and the World Bank and the G7 meetings and so on. It's, in fact, the international business press is pretty upfront about it. They call it a de facto world government, which is going to reflect these interests.
It seems that the Clinton-Gore administration is going to be in a major conflict over its support for NAFTA and GATT, at the same time, at least on a rhetorical level, talking about its commitment to environmental protection and creating jobs for Americans. I mean, there seems to be a major conflict there.
I'll be very surprised if there's a big conflict over that, because I think your word rhetorical was accurate. I mean, their commitment is to U.S.-based corporations, which means transnational corporations, and they very much like this special form that NAFTA's taking, with protection for property rights, but no protection for workers' rights, and with the methods being developed to undercut environmental protection and so on. That's in their interests, and I doubt that there's going to be a conflict in the administration about this, unless there's a lot of public pressure.
There's almost been like a domino effect in terms of Canada, the United States, and Mexico, and the domino effect being that sort of bogus theory that was created in the 50s, that if one country fell, another country would fall. Canadian businesses moving to states in the Deep South, and U.S. businesses moving to Mexico. So there is a kind of domino effect at work.
Yeah, and furthermore, remember, Canadian and U.S. business are pretty closely interlinked. When we talk about, we have to be very careful now when we talk about, we use words like Canada, United States, Mexico. I mean, these terms always were a kind of propaganda terms, which covered up a lot, but it's becoming more and more the case I mean, you just have to look at some of the figures. I mean, about 10 years ago, when the latest figures were made available, United Nations figures, about 10 years ago, about 40% of world trade was internal, was intra-firm transfers, transfers internal to a particular corporation. That is, it was centrally managed trade. It's not really trade, it's just interchanges between one or another branch of a big transnational corporation. That's 40% of world trade. It's undoubtedly the figure's higher now. You take a look at neoclassical economics, the kind of stuff you're supposed to bow before. It has a theory about this. It's based on the theory that there's a kind of a free market. Ideally, there's sort of a free market sea, and within it there are islands, little islands, which are individual firms. I mean, of course, everybody understood that a particular business, say, a grocery store down the street, internally doesn't work by free trade. Internally, it's centrally managed. Well, okay, so you got these centrally managed islands in the free market sea. Well, the free market sea was always more or less of a joke, but by now the islands are about the scale of the sea. This is increasingly centrally managed trade by major corporate structures, and it's a kind of mercantilism. In fact, it's been called corporate mercantilism, with its own governmental structures developing, and the public increasingly marginalized to a pretty remarkable extent.
Talk, if you will, about the political economy of food, its production and distribution, and particularly within the framework of the IMF and World Bank, which you mentioned. They extend loans under very strict conditions to the South, under the condition to promote the market economy, and they need to pay back these loans in hard currency, and they have to increase exports like coffee so that we can drink cappuccino, and beef so that we can eat hamburgers. All this at the expense of indigenous agriculture. Well,
if you have a look at it, there's some you really have to look. Basically, the pictures the way you describe, and the individual cases are quite interesting. So take the great economic miracle in Latin America, which is now being used as the basis for applying the same medicine in Eastern Europe. In fact, the same people are going. Jeffrey Sachs, the leading Harvard expert, who carried it through what's considered the highly successful economic miracle in Bolivia, then went off to Poland and Russia to teach them the same rules. And it's interesting to have a close look. So take, say, Bolivia. Bolivia was in trouble. It had brutal dictators and highly repressive, and was a huge debt and the whole business. And he went in. I mean, the West went in. Sachs was the advisor with the IMF rules, stabilize the currency, increase export, agro-export, cut down production for domestic needs, subsistence agriculture, and so on and so forth. And it worked. I mean, the figures look quite good. The macroeconomic statistics, look good. The currency has been stabilized. The debt's been reduced. GNP is increasing, and so on. I mean, there are a few little flaws in the ointment. So poverty has rapidly increased. Malnutrition has increased. The educational system, what it was, has collapsed. But most interesting is what is a close look at what has in fact stabilized the economy. What in fact has stabilized the economy is indeed agricultural exports, but not coffee, rather coca. Which is now probably accounts for about 2/3 of Bolivian exports. And the money, and the reason's obvious. I mean, you take a peasant farmer somewhere, and you flood his area with U.S. subsidized agriculture, maybe through a Food for Peace program or something, so he can't produce, he can't compete. You set up a situation in which the only way he can function is as an agricultural exporter. He's not an idiot. I mean, he's going to turn to the most profitable crop, which happens to be coca. Now, of course, the peasants don't get much out of this. They get very little, and they also get the guns and the DEA helicopters and so on. But they get something. At least they can survive, and you get a huge flood of coca exports. The profits mostly go to the big syndicates, or for that matter, to New York banks. nobody knows how many billions of dollars of this pass through New York banks or their offshore affiliates, but it's undoubtedly plenty. Plenty of it goes to U.S.-based chemical companies, which are, as is well known, are exporting chemicals to Latin America far beyond any industrial needs, namely the chemicals that are used in cocaine production, which is an industrial activity. So there's plenty of profit. It's probably giving a shot in the arm to the U.S. economy as well, and it's contributing nicely to the international drug epidemic, including here. Well, that's the economic miracle in Bolivia. Incidentally, that's not the only case. But yes, these are the kinds of consequences that will follow from what has properly been called IMF fundamentalism. It's having a disastrous effect everywhere it's applied, except that it's regarded as successful. And from the point of view of the perpetrators, it is quite successful. So Latin America is supposed to be undergoing a dramatic recovery, and in a sense they are. I mean, as you privatize, as you sell off public assets, there's lots of money to be made, so much of the capital that fled Latin America is now coming back. The stock market's doing nicely. Meanwhile, you take a look at the cases, so say Chile, another big economic miracle. The poverty level has increased from about 20% during the Allende years up to about 44% now after the great miracle, and similarly in country after country. But the elite sectors, the professionals, the businessmen, they're very happy with it, and they're the ones who make the plans and write the articles and so on. So there's a lot of praise for the economic miracle here too. The public it's just a far more exaggerated version of what we're seeing here. I mean, here we see it in a relatively mild way as compared with the third world. But the structural properties are the same.
Well, between
wealthy sectors doing fine. The general public is in deep trouble.
Well, between 1985 and 1992, for example, in the United States, Americans suffering from hunger rose from 20 to 30 million. This, while novelist Tom Wolfe, who's a great admirer of yours, he describes the 80s as one of the great golden moments that humanity has ever experienced.
Actually, there was if you take a look at last Sunday's New York Times Magazine, there was an article which was properly apolitical, but if you just add the background politics, you can explain it. It was about the Boston City Hospital and the kinds of which is the hospital for the poor in Boston, the general public, not the fancy Harvard teaching hospital. They didn't say so in the article, but they a couple of years ago had to institute a malnutrition clinic because they were getting third world levels of malnutrition, and their funds are so slight that they have to institute triage, take the cases that you can save more easily. That's something that never happened before. Most of the deep starvation and malnutrition in the country had pretty well been eliminated by Great Society programs, the programs of the 60s. But by the early 80s, as you say, it was beginning to creep up again, and now it's, latest estimates are 30 million people or so in deep hunger. In Boston City Hospital, for example, it gets much worse over the winter, the malnutrition, because parents have to make this agonizing decision between heat and food, and the effect is, the kind of thing that's described in that article. Children dying because, they're not getting water with some rice in it.
The group World Watch says that one of the solutions to the shortage of food is the control of population. Do you support efforts to limit population?
Well, first of all, there is no shortage of food. There's problems of distribution, serious problems of distribution. However, that aside, I think undoubtedly there should be efforts to control population. Now, there are well-known ways to control population, namely increase the economic level. Population is very sharply declining in industrial societies. Many of them are barely reproducing their own population. So take, say, Italy, which is a late industrializing country, but has been industrializing. The birth rate now doesn't reproduce the population. And that's a standard phenomenon. It happens all over the place, and the reasons are pretty well understood. And that's actually the best method of economic development is the best method population reduction.
Coupled with education?
Coupled with education and, of course, means. You know, you have to provide the means for birth control. Here, the United States has just had a terrible role. I mean, it will not help fund efforts, even to international efforts, even to provide education about birth control.
The globe is burning while various Neros are fiddling. A study reported in the current issue of the British journal Nature indicates with greater precision than ever before and certainty that global warming is increasing. It predicts anywhere from a 4 to 6 degree increase in temperature. The resulting change in the Earth's climate would have disruptive and possibly catastrophic consequences for both human society and natural ecosystems.
This has been pretty well known to scientists for over 20 years. I remember when I first heard it from the head of the Meteorology and Earth Sciences Department at MIT, who was a very noted scientist and incidentally a big skeptic about catastrophism, but back by about 1970 he was completely convinced that there's no way out of this. And there had been much debate about the timing, but the course of development is not really in doubt, except for, there's some holdouts like the editors of the Wall Street Journal, but it's pretty clear. And this new study, which was also reported yesterday, I think, in the New York Times science section, seems to sharpen up the estimates. Actually, pretty much it narrows the range that had already been assumed and just adds more evidence to it. I mean, nobody can be certain about these things. Of course, there's always going to be a margin of error, but to play games with these possibilities is just insane. I mean, you have to assume a kind of worst-case analysis.
Carl Sagan was speaking here in Boulder a few months ago, and he talked about the environmental crises transcending narrow state interests and state abilities to address them, thus opening the way to global cooperation. And I know this is something that you've talked about as well.
Well, the question is, who's going to do the global cooperation? There's plenty of global cooperation going on.
The global enforcer.
I mean, there's that, and then there's also what I mentioned before, this de facto world government, reflecting the needs and the interests of the international corporations and banks. That's global cooperation. What is lacking, however, is global cooperation arising out of popular democratic structures. And that's not only lacking, it's declining because the democratic structures are declining. So talk about global cooperation is not helpful. Global cooperation among transnational corporations is just going to make the problem worse.
Well, that's coupled by what can only be described as a surge in tribalism all over the world. Nationalism, religious fanaticism, racism, from LA to the Balkans to the Caucasus to India. Why now?
Is there a way for you to hold off for 1 second? There's somebody at the front door. Can you cut the tape for a minute?
Well, there's a burst, a surge in in tribalism, nationalism, religious fanaticism, racism from Los Angeles to the Balkans to the Caucasus to India. Why is that all going on now?
Well, first of all, let's remember that it's always been going on. So, for example, people are...
Well, I grant you that, but it seems more pronounced.
It's, in parts of the world, it's more pronounced. So, for example, take Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe, up till a couple of years ago, was under the control of a very harsh tyranny. Well, a tyranny like the Soviet system basically immobilizes the civil society. And immobilizing the civil society means you eliminate what's good in it, but you also eliminate what's bad in it. One of the things that was bad in that civil society traditionally was very bitter ethnic hatreds. Europe altogether is a very racist place, even worse than we are. But Eastern Europe was particularly ugly. One of the reasons why I'm here, a lot of our grandparents fled from that. And it was kind of it was held down by the general repression of civil society, which repressed democratic forces, but also repressed ethnic hatreds and hostilities. And now that the tyranny's gone, all of the civil society is coming back up, including its warts, of which there are plenty. Elsewhere in the world, say in Africa, yes, there are all kind of atrocities. They were always there. I mean, one of the worst atrocities is in the 1980s, South African atrocities, meaning U.S.-backed atrocities, from 1980 to 88 approximately, were responsible for about 1.5 million deaths, killings, plus about $60 billion of damage, only in the region surrounding South Africa. Now, nobody here batted an eyelash about that because the U.S. was backing it. If you go back to the 70s, say in Burundi, there was a huge massacre, hundreds of thousands of people killed. Nobody cared. There is in Western Europe, you are getting an increase in localism, and this is in part a reflection of the decline in the in my opinion, is part a reflection of the decline in the representative character of the democratic institutions. So as the European community consolidates slowly, and as it consolidates towards executive power reflecting big economic concentrations, other people are trying to find other ways to preserve their identity. And that does lead to a lot of localism. I mean, that's not the whole factor, but it's a lot of it. In the United States, you are getting an increase in, first of all, what's called racism in the United States. We should be a little bit careful. Doubtless, you take, say, South Central Los Angeles, yeah, sure, there's plenty of racism. But remember that there's an unpronounceable 5-letter word in the United States, namely class. And a lot of the conflict is, in fact, class. So if you look at there's tremendous disparities between black and white populations in health and infant mortality and so on. But a substantial factor of that is actually a class factor. At every class level, from homeless up to executive, blacks are worse off than whites. Nevertheless, a lot of the disparity between what's called blacks and whites just reduces to the difference. Poor whites are not much better off than poor blacks, barely better off. Race and class are pretty well correlated, so you get other confusions. But to a substantial extent, these are class issues. And as the population moves towards a kind of a third world character, for the reasons we've been talking about, people get bitter and desperate, and as the democratic institutions become more and more evacuated of content, people just look for other things. They may look for a savior, like a guy from Mars, like Ross Perot, or they may turn to religious fanaticism, or other things.
Or resurrect the Kennedy myth.
Yeah, Kennedy myth is another case, in my opinion.
Well, Germany is the country everyone loves to hate. It's a very convenient target. And it's interesting to see what the German government response has been to the incidents in that country, to restrict immigration, which they have the most liberal asylum policies in the world, limit civil liberties, and ban political parties.
Yeah. Well, when anything happens in Germany, people get pretty upset for obvious, and they're right. I mean, there is a history after all. Nevertheless, we should remember a few things. As you said, Germany had the most liberal policy. Furthermore, Germany had by far the largest number of refugees. Europe is an extremely racist place. There's a lot of the localism is way beyond anything that we're used to. So to an extent, that you'd rarely find here, people tend to live near where they were raised, and they hate the person in the next village, and so on. There's a lot of talk about German racism, and it's bad enough. So, like, for example, kicking out the gypsies and sending them off to Romania. I mean, that is such a scandal. You can't even describe it. The gypsies were treated just like the Jews in the Holocaust. And nobody's batting an eyelash about that because nobody gives a damn about the gypsies. But we should remember that there are other things going on, too, which are getting less publicized. So take, say, Spain. Spain was admitted into the European community with some conditions. And one of the conditions is that it's to be what is pretty openly called a barrier to these hordes of Africans, North Africans, who the Europeans are afraid are going to flock up to Europe. It's a narrow distance right there, and Spain's right there. In fact, there are plenty of boat people trying to get across from North Africa to Spain, just like kind of like Haiti and the Dominican Republic, boats sinking in the Mediterranean, or if they happen to make it, being expelled immediately by the Spanish police and navy and so on. Very ugly. There's, of course, reasons why people are going from Africa to Europe and not the other direction. In fact, there's 500 years of reasons for that. But it's happening, and Europe doesn't want it. They want to preserve their wealth and keep the poor people out. The same problem's happening in Italy. There was an electoral victory yesterday or the day before by the Lombard League, a group that has a lot of things, but one of the things it has is a kind of a neo-fascist element, and it reflects northern Italian interests. And part of their concern is, again, the same thing. North Africans drifting up through Sicily and into Italy and, coming up in the south, and they don't want them. They want rich white people. And that's throughout Europe, big issue. Europe has not been a heterogeneous society to anything like the extent that the United States has, nor has it been a mobile society to the extent that the United States has. So these matters have been a bit under the cover, but they're harder to keep under the cover.
Noam, in the moment we have left, I know you have 2 new books coming out. Could you tell us briefly what they're about and their titles?
One, which will be out in a couple of weeks, is called Year 501. And as the title indicates, it's about, it's an effort to kind of rethink, look back over the major themes of the past 500 years, which are the period of, briefly, the European conquest of the world, and to look at the forms that it's taken, the principles and themes that underlay it, and to ask what they suggest about Year 501, meaning the future. And in my opinion, it's basically more of the same, adapted to current contingencies with elements of the kind we've been discussing, and so that's that book. The second book is called Rethinking Camelot, and it's the main focus of it actually is on 2 years, 1963-64, the presidential transition, and the planning for the Vietnam War. That's a fascinating period, which we probably know more about than almost anything maybe in American history. There's a huge amount of documentation. It's extremely important, of course. It led to the last major, one of the largest atrocities of the whole 500-year era, namely the Indochina War, which had enormous consequences, and major decisions were being made right at that time. It takes on added interest because of the fact that there was a presidential transition and, in fact, an assassination, which has led to a lot of, in my view, fantasies, but at least beliefs, that something crucial happened, and that some major change in American political history took place at the time of the Kennedy assassination, which just cast a pall on everything that followed, and so on. This has been fostered in large part by Kennedy intellectuals, who, and this is quite an interesting story, after the Tet Offensive in 1968, when corporate America basically called off the war, they completely changed their story as to what had happened. You take a look at the people who had written memoirs and Kennedy's associates and so on. They came out with new versions, totally different from the old ones, in which it turned out that Kennedy was a secret dove and he was trying to withdraw and so on. There's not a hint of that in any of the earlier versions, or for that matter in the secret record, or in fact anywhere else. But they have an obvious stake in trying to recover the image of Camelot and make it look beautiful and so on and so forth. And also large sectors of the popular movements have been involved in this, and in fact, to a certain extent, even immobilized by these ideas, especially in the last year or two.
One of the tough things about doing phone interviews is that I can't wave my hands or point at the clock and say we're running out of time.
Okay.
But in fact, we are out of time. Are those books going to be published by South End Press?
Yes, South End.
Terrific. Well, thanks very much for joining us, Noam Chomsky.
Okay, good to talk to you.
I'm David Barsamian. Thank you for listening.